Our second speaker of the morning is Robert B. Pippin, the Evelyn Stephenson Neff Distinguished Service Professor in the Committee on Social Thought and the Chair of the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. He previously taught at the University of California, San Diego. He earned his PhD from Penn State University in 1974. Arguably more than anyone else in the Anglo-American philosophical world, Robert Pippin is responsible for the very considerable rise of interest in Hegel's thought that has taken place since the publication of his path-breaking book, Hegel's Idealism, in 1989. For Dr. Pippin, Hegel is not simply one of the great figures of the philosophical past. Rather, from the first, he has found in Hegel an exemplary thinker for the present age, one whose writings have first to be understood in the context of problems inherited from Kant and his immediate successors, but which then can be seen to bear closely on problems in the philosophy of mind, art, action, and continental and English language traditions. More recently, he's ranged widely across the 19th and 20th centuries, with magisterial essays on figures such as Nietzsche, Heidegger, Blumenberg, Gadamer, and Strauss, as well as a highly original book on the novelist Henry James. He's currently putting the final editorial touches to a book-length study of Hegel's theory of agency. He was the 2001 winner of the Mellon Foundation Distinguished Achievement Award. He's written many, many books. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and was elected a member of the APS in 2009. And based on a conversation that we had at dinner last night, we are in for a treat from his talk entitled The Philosophical Hitchcock.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be in the Society and a great pleasure to have this chance to talk to you about the film that a few years ago was voted by the Sight and Sound movie critics, who do a poll every 10 years, as the greatest film ever made. It's a difficult topic. I've never talked for 20 minutes about anything in my life, so I'm going to have to read the paper and make sure I don't digress too much. The possible intersection of film and philosophy has become a more prominent topic in the last, let me see if I can get the right slide up. Yeah, that one. Has become a more prominent topic in the last 20 or 30 years. I mean by this intersection not the philosophy of film, the kind of art it is and its relation to other arts, but film as itself a mode of reflective thought. This is due largely to the influence of the Harvard philosopher Stanley Cavell and the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze. We don't have a lot of time to explore that theme in particular, but I can offer here just one brief example of what such an intersection might look like. The film I'd like to discuss is Alfred Hitchcock's masterpiece, his 1958 movie, Vertigo. The problem at issue is how we might come to understand another's behavior, attitudes towards us, intentions, beliefs, and so forth, a form of understanding that is largely interpretive rather than observational. The fact that it's interpretive has a number of implications. It's a skill rather than a technique. Some people can do it better than others, but can't tell others how they do it better. It's not formalizable. It's a different modality of knowledge altogether. What's also fascinating is that it's as relevant to the understanding of what's going on in a film as it is in understanding the behavior and actions of others. The particular problem I want to talk about is familiar. It's sometimes said that in any romantic relationship between two people, there are actually 6 persons involved. There are the 2 persons they actually are, there are the 2 persons as they see themselves, and there are the 2 persons as they're each seen by the other. Once starting down such a road, though, it's hard to stop. One could say there is also for each the person they aspire to be seen as by the other. This might be quite different from the person each actually is and the person they see themselves as. That would get us to 8. And there could be a difference between the person they take themselves to be seen as by the other and the person they are really seen to be by the other. That would get us to 10. And if we import a Freudian thesis, the opposite sex parent of each participant also would seem involved. and that would get us to 12. Quite crowded, no matter the size of the drawing room or bedroom. The cinematic representations of how we deal with the implications of such uncertainty is the central theme of Vertigo. We need at this point a plot summary, but a detailed one will exhaust way more than the 20 minutes I'm allowed, but here is an extremely breathless summary. The film is a story of a murder plot. The plot is the most improbable, unlikely, and risky in the history of film. There are about 1,000 things that could go wrong with it, but we're asked to simply suspend our disbelief. A wealthy shipping magnate, Gavin Elster, wants to murder his wife, Madeline. He sees in the paper that his old college friend, Scotty Ferguson, played by Jimmy Stewart, has had to resign from the police force because he discovers that he has acrophobia and gets vertigo in high places. He froze after falling, contributing to the death of a colleague who tried to help. Elster hires Scotty to follow his wife, saying that she believes herself to be possessed by an ancestor, her great-grandmother, Carlotta Valdez, who wants her to commit suicide. He then has his mistress, the Kim Novak character, impersonate his wife, seduce Scotty, and lure him to a mission tower, knowing that he cannot climb very high. Elster hurls the body of his real wife off the tower, and Scotty is the perfect witness to a staged suicide that's actually a murder. Scotty, who thinks his beloved Madeline is actually dead, suffers a nervous breakdown, and when released, wanders the streets, visiting the places he used to visit with Madeline, the woman he thinks is Madeline. He comes across a shop girl, Judy Barton, also played by Kim Novak, who bears an uncanny resemblance to Madeline. It's only at this point in the film, 2/3 of the way through it, that we, the viewers, discover the truth about everything we have seen. Up to this point, we are as much in the dark as Scotty about the murder plot. Scotty persuades Judy to let him remake her as Madeline. Hair, makeup, clothes, and so forth. And when finished, he exults in the fantasy of a lover returned from the dead. But Judy had saved a telltale clue, a necklace that gives away the plot. Scotty hauls her back to the tower and forces the whole truth out of her. At a crucial moment in what might be a reconciliation between them, Judy is startled by a nun climbing the tower and falls backward to her death. So for the third time, a body goes hurling past Jimmy Stewart. The film ends with Scotty cured of his vertigo. It's an interesting thematic issue in itself. But alone, looking down at the body of his dead lover, the twice-dead Madeline. But to return to our problem, the putative distinctions and tensions in life among these levels of self-presentation in the public world, who I take myself to be, who I am, and the person you take me to be, especially in intimate relations where each matters a great deal to the other, often show up in conflict, misunderstanding, offense, wounded vanity, and attempts to set things right. Moreover, every moderately psychologically aware person is also aware of the possibility of such discordance and can take that into account too. So there is some evolving, mutable, functional interdependence among my understanding of another, my understanding of their understanding of me, and my self-understanding, as well as mutable assumptions about what could or could not be possible given the other and given the terms in which he or she matters to me. The relationship, in other words, is dynamic, not static. What happens, what people do, is much more important than what people say, since the latter is never completely trustworthy, even if the speaker is sincere. Self-deceit is a factor in human life. So often our only means of determining what is real and what is theatrical is what we see, what we think we see, in what a person does and in a person's face. This is a kind of visual intelligibility not unrelated to all painting and film. So it's not for nothing that the mysterious opening credits of Vertigo focus on a face, the face of some unknown woman, never shown in its entirety and not a character in the film. It's only shown in half close-up and then in sections. She's not a character in the film, and her identity and role in the film are never returned to, never explained. And we literally are supposed to read the real names of the actors on the face, highlighting, of course, the issue of reading a face, reading and understanding a face. So in the first part of the film, the Elster plot to murder his wife, since each is pretending to be someone else, we start out with at least 4 publicly presented selves and privately concealed selves. There is who Scotty really is, a retired detective, and who Madeline really is. Judy Barton, Elster's mistress, enlisted to seduce Scotty so that he could be used in the plot. Then there is the person Scotty is pretending to be, a casual wanderer with no connection to Madeline's husband, who just happens on Madeline as she fakes a suicide attempt and jumps in San Francisco Bay, and who Judy is pretending to be, Elster's wife. Hitchcock's very aware of what he's doing and occasionally gives you a picture of how many real and apparent selves are in play. And we might also add the person whom Scotty takes Madeline to be. He actually seems to buy the possession by ancestor fiction, or at least fears that it could lead to real suicide, and the person Madeline takes Scotty to be. She knows he's not a casual wanderer. In some sense, she knows more about him than he does, and that he has been set up. But she understands herself, very crucial in the movie, to really fall in love with the actual Scotty. That is, each of them knows something about the other that they pretend not to know. And of course, even though this is a highly exaggerated plot, that's not unusual in human life. One of the great complications raised by the film, as if all of this were not complication enough, has to do with, given all this posing and self-presentation, who is the woman whom Scotty falls in love with in the first third of the movie? And what consequences flow from the near impossibility of distinguishing real from apparent in this and perhaps in many such important relationships. Now, unknowingness in various forms in general, from ignorance to being deceived to fantasy thinking to self-deceit, is something like a necessary condition of the possibility of Hitchcock's cinematic world. There is no other director as adept and insightful in exploring cinematically what it is to live in, to endure, such a state of profound unknowingness, as well as depicting what great risks lie in store for anyone who challenges everyday complacency, the easy confidence that things are largely what they seem to be. That easy confidence itself, not acknowledging or appreciating the depth of this unknowingness, is also full of risks, chief of which is a moralism narrow enough to count as a kind of blindness. The list of his films in which the wrong person is blamed for or suspected of something, often confidently, smugly blamed, is very long. And the primary technique used by Hitchcock to draw viewers into the film, to in effect co-experience it rather than merely observe it, is suspense, one built around either what we or characters know that others don't, or what we and other characters don't know but see that we need badly to know in a dangerous situation. There are shadows of doubt everywhere in his films, doubts that have all sorts of implications for what the characters decide to do, and a kind of doubt that is not easy to eliminate. In this film, as we've already seen, the unknowingness theme has a specific inflection, a concentration on these multiple and shifting personae, a theme obviously also related to acting and to film in general, with Hitchcock creating and deploying personae as actively as Elster and Scotty. Actually, in this film, these multiple personae by Hitchcock sometimes get quite out of hand. It's well known that he wanted Vera Miles to play the role that Kim Novak actually played, and Kim Novak often complained that he directed her to be Vera Miles playing it. So we have Kim Novak playing Vera Miles, playing Judy Barton, playing Madeline, playing Carlotta Valdez at various points in the movie. This link between increasing social dependence, something that for Rousseau, for example, in his famous critique of society, says begins with the division of labor itself, and a growing fear of untrustworthy theatricalized public personae, either in submission to this dependence or in some self-deceived insistence on absolute independence, is easy enough to see in life. We're conscious of our dependence on others and know that we have to take some care, sometimes great care, about how we are perceived if we are to achieve any of our ends, and that we must depend on others, knowing that they are also taking such care. Since each of us knows this about the other, part of taking such care involves assessing the genuineness of the self-representations of others, such that aspects of our own self-representation will already reflect such an assessment. In ever more complicated networks of dependence, much of what we accept as a fact, as reality, especially the large swath of reality that we cannot see or experience ourselves, is unavoidably a matter of testimony from others with whom we are sometimes in competition as well as cooperation, and many others who we know have their own agendas and frailties. We are clearly in the world of Henry James and Marcel Proust. There is an implicit ideal in all of this, representing oneself as one actually is, and being taken by others to be who one actually is. But Hitchcock is also interested in showing us what makes this so hard in romantic relations, the ineliminable role of fantasy and desire in such self-presentations and in being perceived. I've only the time left to if I have any time left, to discuss two scenes in the film to indicate how this might work. The first is an invocation of the femme fatale introduction in film noir, where the male anti-hero is often struck dumb, agentless, captivated by the allure of the femme fatale. The scene I want to show is the first time Scotty sees the fake Madeline. And at the end of the scene, Hitchcock suggests that this female power is also wrapped up in male fantasy and projected desire. So when we first see Madeline made up by Elster, or Judy Barton made up as Madeline, later in the film we see how Scotty sees her in silhouette, a kind of blank screen on which this desire can be projected. Well, here is the opening itself. There's a great deal to say here, which I don't have time to talk about the cinematic details of the movie, the actual formal elements. There's a beautifully photographed scene, every second of which has some thematic importance. You can also see at the very, very end, in the last second of the scene, how just a tiny gesture by Jimmy Stewart indicates how captivated he is by what he's seen. So I think I have to start this way. I'm not pushing the button properly. And you should dull the lights too. Thank you. Yeah, you really need the lights down. You'll hear the Bernard Herrmann theme, which I'll say something about in a second. It's really what the movie starts officially. Just that little gesture. In the course of following the fake Madeline around, she fakes a suicide attempt by jumping into San Francisco Bay. Scotty rescues her, and we can already see in the still I put up at the very beginning how his concern for her, knowing nothing about her individually, goes far beyond the duties of a good Samaritan. I don't think I have time to show this. Remarkably, Scotty does not seek medical treatment for Madeline, but takes her back to his apartment. Madeline continues throughout to pretend that she is unconscious, and so allows Scotty, probably worried about hypothermia, to completely undress her and put her to bed. We know this because after we reach his place, we see the inside of his apartment, and a right-to-left pan shows all of her clothes, undergarments included, hanging on a line in the kitchen, and then shows us her sleeping naked in his bed when she wakes up to a phone call. Kim Novak's actually only 24 in this movie. When she's made up as Madeline, she looks maybe 30 or 31, but here and subsequently she looks her age, 24. This whole setup with respect to our theme is a beautifully thought out framing scene. It's when she's naked that Judy is at her most deceptive, and it's when she's elaborately remade and clothed by Scotty that the genuineness of Judy's love for Scotty can be seen and reciprocated. This is a scene as she exits the bedroom after she's awakened, and it's paired by the scene where she comes out of the bathroom as remade as Madeline. And I have time, I think, to show you the whole scene of the final transformation of Judy into the dead Madeline, if I can get it to go. All right, now I'm going to just... I mean, I swear I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. There's a magic finger. This is the resolution of the Bernard Harmon. It's modeled on Tristan and Isolde from Wagner, very, very close. And just like in Tristan and Isolde, the theme is not resolved until 5 hours into the actual opera. If you've ever seen the opera, you know what sense of relief you have when the melody finally is resolved. Same thing happens here. This is the first time we hear the resolution of the melody. I'm sorry. I wish I could let that go all the way to the end, but it's kind of I'm more important than the movie. I have to do this last paragraph. The scene not only sweeps Scotty away, it is clearly intended to, and largely does, sweep us away in a brief moment of relief and emotional release. Perhaps we are swept away because the desire to recreate the erotic power of a past is not just an erotic obsession of one character. The relation between, or the great tension between romantic love, the beginnings of a relationship, and companionate marital love, its future, is a very important theme in Hitchcock, paradigmatically in Rear Window. And the rituals in marital love that seek to recreate the original romantic love are testimony to the power of this fantasy in everyday life. We know when we watch this that Scotty is still deceived, and we sense that something catastrophic is about to happen, but we're invited to, and I think we largely do, indulge ourselves in the passion of the moment. How could we not? It's the most devoutly wished in any human fantasy, overcoming death itself, bringing a loved one who has died back to life. Typical of Hitchcock, we can identify with Scotty's ecstatic experience, and one has to be made of stone or consumed by cynicism not to be carried away by this return to the past and to the earliest moments of their love, even while we appreciate the irony. He thinks he has created a simulacrum, a theatricalized version of Madeline, but he has authored the real Madeline, the Madeline whom he loved, because she was a simulacrum, played by the same actress, Judy. But as he says, there's no second chance. This is all we have time for, but I want to suggest that there are problems like these in philosophy. How can we ever reliably understand one another, given how our dependence on each other and our desires create so many incentives to misrepresent and misunderstand that are not problems with a solution, as if there could be a theory of other knowledge that could be defended abstractly. There is and can be no such theory, but we can at least try to understand the nature of the difficulties and the nature of the importance of such ideals and such barriers. But for that, I think we also need imaginative geniuses like Alfred Hitchcock. Thanks for your attention.
Okay, we'll take questions, but I'm going to take the prerogative of asking the first one. So I'm probably not the only person to whom it has occurred that the state of unknowingness exists not only in film or in romantic love, but in our politics. Mm-hmm. So I think we're all living in a state of unknowingness about, is our president-elect the Donald Trump who presented himself as a candidate for president, the, quote, Donald Trump who was a reality television star, which I'm willing to bet none of us ever saw on television, or, you know, what does philosophy tell us about the construction of the political persona? How do we think about this?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's just an enormous question. I mean, the first thing of relevance is that Hitchcock is not really of much help here because he thinks we're actually very bad at this, very bad at distinguishing theatricalized personae from real persons. We're tremendously susceptible to theatrical illusions for all sorts of reasons. The one he's concentrating on is romantic fantasy. And the idea, though, that the public selves of characters are theatricalized has now become a staple of mass media, television, and you know, all of the media that are now operative. But the thing about it that's at least interesting, although not adequate to your question, is that the deceitfulness of theatricalized persona also depends to some extent on the self-deceit of the person deceived. Mm-hmm. It's a cooperative enterprise.
Right.
It's not just a passive active in the way a kind of a very clever, hard to detect lie is. And the entire game of politics in the media, especially in major news organizations and so forth and so on, is to indulge in the fantasy that the theatricalized persona, and perhaps politics itself as it is now conducted, has a genuine side that somehow can show through the theatricalized persona even while we don't do anything to actually penetrate that, because there's something for us in our complicity with the carnival that we're all a part of in mass media politics. So very, very complicated, difficult question. Hard enough in romantic love, but in this huge theatricalized, media-dominated world of politics we now live in, infinitely more difficult, because we want the theatricalized. The same thing is true of Hillary. Same thing is true of democratic politics. Of shaping her image and so forth, we want to play along in a way we approve of, but we know we're playing along.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Up in the balcony.
Conrad Harper, New York City. Thank you for that wonderful talk about one of my favorite actors and directors and movies. But I want to ask you how you came to look at Hitchcock this way. Was your work in Henry James and his use of deception as a way of illuminating character and informing part of your approach to Hitchcock?
Gosh, yeah, that is another vast, vast question. I just from the point of view of philosophy, in the tradition of European political philosophy that begins with Rousseau, and in which Hegel plays a central role, there are diagnoses of certain social pathologies that are not really adequately captured by the language of rights and entitlements and the protections of rights and entitlements, by the classical political theories of Locke and Hobbes and all the way to John Rawls, the question simply of the legitimacy of the exercise of the state's monopoly on coercive violence. How is that justified? And Rousseau, in analyzing the state in which we, because of the situation of ever divided and more complicated divisions in labor, are so dependent on each other's, certain kinds of states of conformism and self-deceived independence can also be political harms. They can form the body politic in a way that degrades political will formation in the public world. And this idea that there is something like a political psychology that we need to understand necessary for a healthy pathology is a topic that has pretty much fallen out of classical Anglophone political philosophy. And when I was once asked to give the Castle lectures at Yale, 3 lectures, I wanted to write something about how to revive a discussion of political psychology in a way that would be accessible to an interdisciplinary audience. It wouldn't just be a lecture on Hegel. So I simply conceived the idea of writing a book on Hollywood Westerns, which might not seem the first thing you'd think of for that topic, but most Hollywood Westerns are about the refounding of the American regime after the collapse of the Civil War. They all take place in roughly 1870 to 1890, and as you know, it's in a situation of complete lawlessness and violence, in which the transition to a stable bourgeois society is often the plot of many of the movies. The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, for example, or High Noon, many of the classic, really great films that we categorize as Westerns. And the films are very good at helping us understand the costs of the transition psychologically to a stable, secure regime of representative liberal democracy, and how fragile the conditions for that formation are, and paradoxically, in a way, how much extra-legal violence is sometimes necessary for the establishment that excludes extra-legal violence. And so it occurred to me it might be a better way for especially the students in the lectures that I gave to begin to understand these problems of political pathologies in ways that don't have to do with someone's rights being violated or entitlement or fairness not being. Those are all crucial problems. But I wanted another way of starting. And then I got, because I'm just a lover of movies, I'm in the Committee on Social Thought, so I can do whatever I like. So I just started writing more and more about movies as ways of understanding what we need to understand, not just in politics. That was just the first instance in answering your question, but in questions about agency, the role of fantasy, mutual self-understanding, and other understandings. So it seemed to be that film could be a modality of philosophical thought itself. And very, very controversial in the Academy. I mean, film studies as an area of study in the Academy is very young. It only started in the 1970s. And for many, many colleagues in the university, it's the equivalent of, I don't know, pro wrestling studies or circus studies or something like that. It's not, it hasn't really established itself as a serious discipline in the Academy. I mean, it should, but it's still got a long way to go. And it's an unsettled discipline. What is film theory, and how does one conduct research in the study of film is an interesting problem in the Academy at the moment, because many of the films I'm interested in are also commercial vehicles. They're made by the great Hollywood system to make money. That's certainly true of Hitchcock. And it wasn't until French critics in the 60s that it began to seem possible to argue that even films by John Ford and Howard Hawks and Alfred Hitchcock, which were made by big Hollywood studios as commercial products to be consumed, could also be understood as great works of art. That's become more possible now, and the realization that Hitchcock may have been the greatest American director who ever worked is now something more and more people are willing to accept, although he becomes very controversial too, because there's so much psychological and psychoanalytic work on Hitchcock as a person. He had a very complicated and frankly relatively perverse personality. And his attitudes towards women and the representation of women in Hitchcock films has generated an enormous amount of attention just in itself. So the idea of approaching Hitchcock this way, rather than socioculturally, is also quite controversial. So lots and lots of controversies. That's a long answer to your question, but it was a difficult question.
Howard.
Yeah, Howard Gardner. I'm from Cambridge. A quick piggyback on Linda. Thinking about yesterday's meeting of Trump and Obama, I wonder whether Hitchcock actually directed it. That's
Yeah.
But I'm a psychologist, and I want to put you and myself on the spot. What do you see as the division of labor between a philosophical Hitchcock and the kind of insights that psychology would have? You probably know that one of the big ideas in psychology the last 10 or 20 years is theory of mind, and how one mind gets to know another, and there's lots of empirical work on that. Do you see this as complementary, at odds with one another? Is psychology going to wipe out philosophy or vice versa? What's the division of labor between those two lenses on any kind of artistic work?
Well, yeah, I'm in the philosophy department in Chicago, but my principal department is the Committee on Social Thought, so in principle, I'm against division of labor. I think everybody's working on the same project, essentially. We're trying to understand what it is to be a human being. And I'll take advice and help from anywhere I can get it, including empirical studies. Those of you who remember the early 1960s remember this wonderful book that hit the Academy very hard and really established a whole discipline in sociology, Irving Goffman's The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. And that established for a long time symbolic interactionism as a major school of sociology. That sort of faded out of the picture now, but that certainly would be an example of something that might help us understand how this dynamics work. The problem is there are so many variables involved and so many particulars that have to be considered for us to get anything close to a realistic picture of how humans actually operate, and the fact that the enterprise is interpretive. This is one thing I think psychology has the most difficulty with, rather than observational. These are not observational data from which we make inferences. It's a different kind of knowledge, and it's much more direct. You know, you may remember a couple of times in Proust, Swann will say after visiting Odette, "I saw her lie in her face. I didn't see her eyes dart and made an inference." That, you know, it's nothing like the TV shows or poker player presentations or something like that. It's a much more direct form of interpretive skill, and that's very difficult to formalize or get into, perhaps except by reflections on how things actually work in presentations by geniuses, of how people come to understand and misunderstand each other.
Unfortunately,